And we are live. Hello, sense, and welcome back to my channel. I do apologize for the long hiatus it's been since we've had a stream, but as I've mentioned, I just rather than do a stream every week, I only want to have one when I have something that I really do want to talk about. And this should be a fun stream tonight. I have not had a debate on this or discussion on this channel for I think it's almost 2 years now. But for those of you who's joining me this evening, some of you may be familiar with the Twitter account Cluffalo. She has caused quite the stir, especially in the manosphere discussions that take place on Twitter, in that I'm pretty sure she is rather critical of the red pill community or the larger manosphere community or whatever you want to call it. And I have seen firsthand she's been engaged by Rollo Tomasi, Rand Stone, and a lot of those other big names within the red pill. So I sent her a message, said, hey, would you be interested in coming on and discussing specifically the issue of marriage? And to my surprise, she said she was. So before we get started here, Allie, if you'd just like to introduce yourself, let everyone know your social media, what you're about, and then we'll get started.
Well, hey, thank you so much for having me. Flattered to be on, especially after your hiatus. I'm Allie. I'm on Twitter, or X, I guess now, as Clefalo. And I mostly tweet about, I guess, conservative, somewhat environmentalism, but mostly relationship stuff these days. I feel like that's what people mostly glom onto. And I'm pretty bullish on it. So I'm excited to get to chat.
Okay, awesome. Well, everyone here has, if you've been on my channel for a while, you'll know I started this channel primarily talking about economics from a libertarian perspective. But as I discovered very quickly, that crosses into a lot of social spheres. And over the past couple of years, I've been doing this since about 2017. As of late, I've got very interested in relationship issues just because I personally believe the nuclear family, the traditional conservative family, is one of the parts of having a healthy society. Now, that being said, I think thanks to the government's involvement, the ability to do so has been very severely degraded. And as a result, if something doesn't change, we are on a collision course for a lot of societal decay in a lot of spheres. But I come at this from, in terms of the manosphere, I think one thing that's important to deal with early on is what is specifically meant by the red pill. Because I'm sure I've seen a lot of your tweets. Anytime you tweet about something red pill related, people will jump on you, say that's not what the red pill is. Of course, even within the manosphere community, there's some measure of disagreement about what the red pill is. But I would say before I get started, I want to lay out what I consider the red pill to be, and then the community I would consider myself to be most broadly a part of within the greater red pill umbrella, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a great way to start.
Okay, so basically, I'm not going to claim I am a spokesperson for the red pill. I mean, there are much larger creators than me that will claim that title for themselves. But I will say, whether you're dealing with the pickup artists, MGTOW, black pill, incels, or any of these other men's communities that broadly call themselves red pill, it is my opinion, the thing that unites them all is they would say the red pill, of course, the analogy of which coming from the movie The Matrix, is a stoic acceptance of human nature as it is, regardless of what we think it should be. And specifically when it comes to relationships, the red pill would be men are inherently polygamous, and barring moral, legal, or societal restraints, men tend to pursue whatever relationship strategy will allow them to have sex with the highest number of women available. Now, again, that's not commenting on whether or not that's moral, just saying that is the male natural tendency. For women, on the other hand, are naturally hypergamous. And again, barring moral, legal, or societal restraints, women tend to pursue whatever relationship will, one, allow them to have children with the most genetically, physically attractive man, and thereafter live with the most security, comfortability, and protection thereafter. Now, again, there are some that'll want to tweak it this way or that, but in my opinion, broadly speaking, that's what all these different men's communities agree on. Now, what you do with that information is entirely up to you. It's not saying it is therefore moral for men to have sex with lots of women. It's therefore moral for women to monkey branch from relationship to relationship, wherever you want, or whatever term you want to use. But the core belief is men and women tend to act this way absent moral, legal, or societal restraints. How would you feel about that as a definition?
I'm happy to move forward with that definition. One of my main critiques of red pill is it's got this no true Scotsman kind of issue of everybody defines it a little differently. But I think that's a fair enough starting point, at least for this discussion.
Okay, and in total fairness, with any community, the larger it gets, the more people you're going to have that are going to infight within the community about no, not this, not that. I mean, I can't. I can find other people who will say that's not the real definition. It's my opinion that like whether you've got all these other communities, the pickup artists, the MGTOWs, the black pill, incel, they all have their own different prescriptions of what they think men should do in light of this information. But they would say, we agree that that's the way it is. Now, here's what we think men ought to do in light of that.
Sure. No, that makes sense. And I totally agree. I don't think it's anyone's specific fault that this happens. I mean, feminists will say that this happened to feminism. Republicans say that this happened to, like, this is not a true Republican. But I always find it interesting because the same Republicans who are like, well, Trump doesn't represent us. I'm like, literally he does. And I think when some of the red pill influencers get super, super famous, or I've seen a lot of people say like Rollo doesn't represent us, or Ryan or Rian or however you say his name doesn't represent us. I'm like, well, you know, just volume wise kind of does at this point. But yeah, no, I think those tenets make sense.
Fair enough. And those guys all have their own influence. I will say, as far as my take in the manosphere community, I called myself from the start my 2 cents for a simple reason, and that is that I am here to give you my opinion. You can take it or leave it, and I'm certainly not one of these idiots who's trying to sell you, buy my course for $800 and I'll teach you this, and I'll teach you the secrets to being a super alpha male who can have as many babes as he wants. I mean, those guys are a joke in my opinion. But I would consider myself part of the MGTOW community, which stands for men going their own way. And of course, even within that, you have people that would define it slightly differently. How I define MGTOW, men going their own way, is I've decided to stop caring what women collectively want or need and start doing what's best for me. And what I mean by that is growing up, especially, you know, from a Christian background, I went to a church youth group that taught purity culture. I kissed dating goodbye, all that stuff. And I was always taught from the time I was young about how important it is that we as men step up and do what's right for women, because we as the stronger sex always need to, you know, put the interests and needs of women before our own, no matter what. I more or less accepted it because that's what I was taught. But along the way, asked the question, you know, I constantly put the needs of women before my own. I see no gratitude for it. And in fact, I'm actively despised and hated by women anyways. Why should I continue to do that? No, I'm not saying I believe in being unkind or deliberately mistreating women, but my viewpoint is essentially, I'm not necessarily swearing off relationships with women entirely, but if I do get involved in a relationship with a woman, it's going to be because that's what I've decided is objectively best for me, regardless of what anyone else thinks. I'm not going to get married because I've been told that I have an obligation to society to get married and have children. I'm not going to have a relationship with a woman that I see as less than ideal because, you know, she's become a Christian now. God forgave her. You have to forgive her too. I'm only going to get involved with a woman if I decide that's what's best for me. Now, if other men decide otherwise, I might criticize your decision if I think it's a bad one, but ultimately, so long as you're doing what you want because that's what you've decided is best for you, then I applaud you. But that's basically how I personally approach the situation.
That makes sense.
Okay, but with all that established then, so we're going to get to the topic of traditional marriage. Now, I have made a video series on my channel called Defending Traditional Marriage, and I would say I would agree with most traditional conservatives that I think traditional marriage, a man and a woman who come together for life and have children, is an objectively good thing for society in that it creates the most stable environment for raising children and preparing them to be successful adults. I think there is a wealth of research that backs that. And in that regard, I think I would say marriage is a good thing. However, historically, the marriage, in order to work, part of the marital vows are you stay together for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. And at least for a time in America and many societies before this, if a couple, if one partner or the other came forward and said, you know what, I don't want to be married anymore, I want a divorce, the law would say, tough, you've made a promise to each other, and now you have to fulfill it. Ever since the 1980s, we now have the law of the land has become no-fault divorce, which is either partner at any time and for any reason can come forward and say they want a divorce, and the other partner has no legal recourse to stop that from happening. They can refuse to sign the papers. They can refuse to, they can try to make the process as difficult as possible. But ultimately, if one spouse says they want out, that's the end of it. Legally, you can't stop them from doing so. And as research has shown, the majority of divorces that take place, J.C. Armitage says, I thought no-fault divorce ended in the 1960s. I'm not sure what you're referencing there, but no-fault, it's my understanding ever since Ronald Reagan's bill in the 1980s, no-fault divorce has been the law of the land. Although there are some states that are talking about bringing it back, putting an end to it, or at least modifying it. But ever since no-fault divorce, we've seen divorce after no-fault divorce was passed, divorce rates rocketed sky high, at least initially, although they did level off. We've seen that the majority of divorces are initiated by women. Now, there's always some dispute on this point about what the exact percentage is. And anywhere from 30 to 50% of marriages end in divorce. And I know it's widely cited, especially by some among the manosphere, that it's 50%. There's a lot of pushback from the tradcon community saying, no, it's not actually that high. It's somewhere around 40 or 35%. Either way, I'll just go with the brackets there and say, I'll be generous. On the low end, it's 30%. On the high end, it's 50%. But somewhere in there, a lot of marriages don't last anymore. And further, from a societal standpoint, at least, men are primarily the ones that bear the risk of marriage. In that, from a legal standpoint, just about any judge is going to say bare minimum 50% of your assets are split husband and wife. If you have any children, most women are by default full custody of, or going to get primary custody of the children, unless you can prove she's somehow unfit to be a mother. You've got alimony payments, which thankfully those aren't necessarily as relevant as they used to be, although for quite some time they have been. But beyond that, really the reputation stain that comes with divorce is that what I have noticed in society is if and when a man divorces his wife, the immediate backlash, especially in conservative Christian communities, will be the church will rally around the man and say, you deadbeat, you idiot, you made a promise to this woman and you have an obligation to stay through it for her and for your kids. I don't care how bad you think it is. This is your obligation. You better man up and deal with it. And if not, we're going to shame you to the ends of the earth. On the other hand, if a woman divorces her husband, regardless of what the church may say their views on divorce are, typically the response is tons of other so-called Christian women rally to her side. You poor, poor baby. Was your husband abusing you? We're here for you. Anything she says about why he was abusive and or a bad man will immediately be accepted by default. And the burden of proof will now be on the man to prove that he didn't do what he's accused of, not the other way around. And further, that reputation follows him quite often in his personal and professional life. So at least in that regard, the social risks of divorce are disproportionately borne by men. So the question must be asked then, if as a man today, divorce is a risk, and you as a man disproportionately bear the risks, why get married? Now, I've said a lot, so before I continue, I'll give you a chance to just chime in anything you want to dispute or add to there.
Yeah, I saw a couple of comments come up in the chat on no-fault divorce, and I think I thought no-fault divorce ended in the 1960s. I think they're just so we can clarify what no-fault divorce is. No-fault divorce is effectively kind of like at-will employment, where you can end a divorce without saying that either party is specifically at fault. So no-fault divorce initially actually started early 70s. And although Reagan did bring it in, it wasn't while he was president. No-fault divorce is a state-by-state basis thing. So it wasn't like it was legalized for the whole country at one point.
You're right. That was when Reagan was in office in California, correct?
Yes, it was him as governor.
Right.
But one thing that I think is super interesting, because when we talk about no-fault divorce, I think a lot of people think that it's been around for a very long time. New York State, which is where I was actually brought up, was the most recent state to legalize no-fault divorce, and it was in 2010. I mean, my parents divorced basically when I was born. I guess they started the official divorce when I was 2. That's when the paperwork was signed. But my parents had an at-fault divorce. And what's interesting about that is I think we often think that, getting rid of no-fault divorce means that people will stay in marriages longer. If you talk to either of my parents, they know darn well that they had basically a no-fault divorce. I think the issue with getting rid of it is that it actually makes things a lot riskier for men, kind of for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned in the church. It's the idea that someone has to be at fault in the divorce kind of raises the stakes, because it either means that you come up with like a BS belief or BS excuse that you guys like both agree on, and you can just say, all right, like, let's just tell them XYZ. Or it means if somebody really wants to get out of that marriage, it's a lot more incentivized for a woman to bring up some sort of abuse or a Me Too, or to claim that one person or the other cheated. So it kind of raises the stakes in a way that I don't think is actually better for men. I don't think, kind of, especially in our modern culture, that I would personally be okay ending no-fault divorce. I think that if culturally we moved that way, it'd probably be a positive, but it's not without risks. And I think it actually introduces a higher degree of risk for men, because it kind of backs people into a corner of like forcing it to be someone's fault.
Okay, well, I think what you mean is that before no-fault divorce, there would have been a greater incentive for the woman to, or the man for that matter, to manufacture a fake fault, if you will.
Yeah,
but I think
or if
still,
we get rid of no-fault divorce, you're
okay.
kind of bringing that back and saying, I honestly, I think before it was legalized, we probably lived in a more normal society where people were less likely. I don't know. I would imagine that people were less likely to, pull out the Me Too thing, but we're post Me Too now. It is, I would say, pretty normalized for women to make up these sorts of things. I mean, as you were mentioning, like the man kind of looks at fault, especially in certain communities, kind of by default. If you say that women can't just divorce a man and they have to tell the courts that he abused them, then they're not just divorcing them, they're also accusing him of abuse, which is something that can stay on your record for a while. So I don't know. I would caution a lot of people against thinking that that's an easy solution, because I think it provides a lot of really perverse incentives for people.
Okay, fair enough. I think where I would disagree with you here, though, is your point assumes that it's good that couples should be able to divorce if they want to. My position is, if you understand what marriage is actually supposed to be, if the marital vows mean anything, it's for better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. This is my solemn vow. When people speak those words, I mean, I can't help but ignore the last part, is till death do us part. In other words, the only thing that can dissolve this marriage is death. Now, I think it goes, any couple that I've ever respected, whose marriage I think is objectively good and successful, will tell you both the husband and the wife have different reasons for wanting to be married. And at different points in the marriage, the husband or the wife typically will benefit more or less than the other person. Therefore, the reason for the covenant is the fact that at various points in the marriage, both the husband or the wife might have various incentives to want to get out. And for the safety and especially the safety of both people, but also for the good of the children. And I can show you plenty of study. I know I can pull it out of my video series that I did about traditional marriage, but the terrible effects that divorce has on children in particular are catastrophic. And I don't believe that marriage is primarily about the happiness of adults. So I don't think saying couples should be allowed to leave if they want to leave so that they don't falsely accuse one another actually assumes it's a good thing that couples should be able to leave if they want to. I don't think that's the case, and I certainly wouldn't call it a conservative viewpoint that it is. So would you?
I don't believe that at all. Just to clarify, okay. I think that marriage should be till death do us part. I think that most of the U.S. is neither conservative nor Christian, and certainly not both. And I think that we can be, conservative about the idea of marriage and that it should be till death do us part. I think divorce is absolutely a heinous institution, and outside of abuse or infidelity, which ideally should really just be, dissolving marriage, if it's unrepentant infidelity specifically. No, I don't think anyone should get divorced. I think that commitments should be for life. I'm just saying that given the types of people that we currently have in the West, and in particular in the US, I would be much more terrified, were I a man, and I'm not, to be in a marriage where if a woman wanted to leave, she had to accuse me of divorce, of abuse. So no, I don't think that divorce is good. I think that there's a lot of women out there, a lot of men out there, but women do initiate more often, who would jump to that abuse allegation, or other types of allegations. I mean, there's other types of at-fault divorce. You can say things like abandonment, etc. But no, I mean, I'm not pro-divorce. I'm just saying that this is kind of how people act, and protecting men would probably start with family court reforms long before it would move to dissolving no-fault divorce. I just don't think that it's like the fix-all, like quick fix that people prop it up to be.
Okay, well, what I would say is this: I'm trying to acknowledge, people are sinful. Not everyone shares and certainly not. I am a Christian. Not all my viewers are, so I don't think non-Christians should be legally barred from being married. But one thing I would say, as a man, when I look at the issue of marriage today, the biggest risk I would see, and just as an aside, I don't talk a whole lot about what I do outside of this, but I'll just let you know I work in the private security sector, and risk management is one of my primary responsibilities. So I have a tendency to look at things from a risk management perspective. And as a man, when I look at the risks, the supposed benefits and risks of being married in today's society, the thing I note, the biggest unknown factor for me is the fact that if my wife, and I think a lot of traditional conservatives will say, well, if you as a man are afraid of divorce, relax. If you marry a woman who, if you guys attend church every week, that cuts your risk of divorce in half. And they'll list all these other things that just do this, and it statistically lowers the likelihood that you'll get divorced. Now, I'm not denying that those things are statistical realities. But as I'm often a fan of saying, and a lot of people who have listened to my show know this, statistics don't lie, liars use statistics. And what that means is that even if I can show that if, for example, a couple that attends church every week is half as likely to divorce as a couple who doesn't, well, and it so it cuts from 40% of marriages end to 20% if the couple attends church regularly, or even I'll be more generous than that. Let's say only 10% of couples who attend church regularly are likely to divorce. Well, clearly, still 10% of couples who attend church weekly still get divorced. So clearly, the attending church factor, while a mitigating factor, it doesn't actually eliminate the risk. And what I, as a man, see the main risk is the fact that it's entirely in my wife's hands. If she decides to divorce, I have no recourse. She can get out, and there's nothing I can do to stop it. And further, there in the society in which we live today, there really aren't any, in my opinion, and if you want to dispute this, fine, but in my opinion, there aren't any real consequences for the woman leaving. If she divorces her husband, the default assumption of most communities, to include so-called conservative Christian communities, is going to be, I bet she, so-and-so divorced her husband. I wonder if he was abusive. I wonder, what he did that would make her do such a thing. Whereas on the other hand, if the man divorces the woman, the instant backlash of that same community is going to be, what a deadbeat, leaving, absconding, neglecting his responsibility to his wife and his children. What a horrible person. We'll never do business with him again. And if anyone wants to dispute otherwise, but I've been to quite a few churches over the last 20 years. And what I've overwhelmingly seen is that if and when men divorce women, the default response is to shame that man and until he comes back and repents. If a woman divorces a man, the default response is give the woman all the love and support she could possibly need and work hard to uncover what the man did to make that to him. Now, would you agree or disagree that that's largely what happens?
I guess I would largely disagree. We probably, I would argue, grew up in pretty different church communities from the sounds of it. I would say that what has tended to be the case when I hear about folks getting divorced is the reaction is either A, that couple is a hot mess and kind of the two of them just weren't able to hack it, or B, if there was like really, really explicit infidelity or something like that, that person really catches all the blame and, oh, he married such a hoe, or maybe he was the hoe or whatever. Like, I don't think that a lot of divorces I've seen seem to have like a clear person that gets blamed in general. I think a lot of times, at least like with folks that I've seen since college, which is admittedly not very long ago for me, but there's still been some divorces because we were very much a ring by spring school. It's kind of just whoever seems like the hotter mess, which in a lot of cases is the woman, especially if she, had a certain reputation or whatever, like partied a lot in college. I have absolutely seen people assume that it was her. And again, these are just like assumptions from the outside. I think when you actually know the couple, 9 times out of 10, you go, oh my goodness, it's 100% both of them. But I don't know. Again, it could just be that we're kind of exposed to different communities.
Okay, and fair,
statistics is,
go ahead, finish.
I was going to say your point on the statistics is well taken. And I think both sides are very guilty of this. I see people like kind of throwing around the like 70% of divorces are initiated by women. And it's like, I don't know. I think statistics are useful insofar as they tell us where population trends are going. I think that they are not very useful as far as making decisions about your own life necessarily, except to the degree that they tell you that your decisions kind of like goosebump style can determine your outcome. And I think that's where I tend to lean on statistics, is to go, all right, you're the captain of your own ship. A lot of people use statistics kind of to act like it's, I compare it to like the sorting hat in Harry Potter, where somebody just decides, okay, you're getting divorced. In reality, yes, your wife can just decide to divorce you one day. And at that point, you don't have anything you can do about it. But the entire marriage leading up to it, both of you were able to affect the outcome in some way. And okay, I think us talking about it, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Nancy Pearcey has fantastic research on the fact that men are actually typically the ones in charge of where relationships go. Not to say that women are exempt from it. I'm not saying they have no accountability. I know I'm going to be accused up and down, but I am saying that like, this isn't just something where like you pick who you're going to marry and then you reach into one of those like balls of marbles that you had in statistics class and out comes your outcome. I don't know. I think that it's far less random than it sounds when people are just citing random divorce statistics.
Okay. And in all fairness, I agree. It's not like when you get married, you just pick randomly out of 100 women and then there you go. Statistically, you're either it's going to succeed or you're going to divorce. No, there's more that goes into that. But I would like to talk about the point of accountability, and that I agree. Like all things, especially when you have a partnership of any kind, where 2 people are involved with one another. I mean, whether we're talking about a marriage, a friendship, a business transaction, both parties make decisions that affect the direction that relationship goes. That's the nature of how it goes. But the point I'm making is, at the end of the day, a person can only be responsible for what they personally do. And sure, a lot of people, and especially if you come from a conservative Christian background and you believe in traditional gender roles, what we're taught is the man, as the head of the household, is overall bears responsibility for the family. He is the head of the family, and we talk about biblical headship a lot. And just to give an example, there was a great blog that used to be out there called Dalrock. I'm not quite sure what happened to him. Nowadays, when you go to his blog, it says this is a private site and you can't access it anymore. But I do remember an article he wrote that was really stuck out to me, and that he was critiquing a Christian pastor had written an article basically explaining how he handles marital counseling. And what he said was, when a man and a woman come to me for marital counseling, I always start with the assumption that the man is 100% at fault for everything that goes on in the marriage. And he went on to say, the reason for this is the man is the head of the household. He has overall responsibility. And regardless of what the woman did, the man, because he's in charge and because he is the head of the relationship, he always has responsibility. And he says responsibility is not the same as guilt. And then he went on to cite, in the U.S. Navy, if the captain of the ship, if the ship runs aground, even if the captain was asleep in his stateroom at the time, the captain still gets relieved of command because the captain is overall responsible for everything that happens, even if he didn't personally cause it. Now, what Dalrock pointed out is the analogy fails because if we're going to use the U.S. Navy as an example, every sailor on that ship is unconditionally required to obey the captain, whether he's a tyrant or whether he's a loving leader. They have to obey. And it's in virtue of the fact that he has that absolute authority that he also has responsibility. However, if we're in a situation where if for example, any sailor on that ship unilaterally decide, I don't like the captain, I'm ejecting him from command and taking command of this vessel at any time, well, now the captain's in a position where he'd better please his sailors and do what they want, or else they'll kick him out. And in that case, it's not really the captain who's responsible anymore. It's whoever's making the decision. And the position a lot of modern men find themselves in, and this is a point I would like to bring up, they say only X percentage of marriages end in divorce, which, okay, we can debate about what the actual percentage is. The question I would like to see studied, and what I've looked, I've found no sites to this effect, but I really think it would be insightful, in how many of the marriages that ultimately stay together does the wife at any point say to the husband, you are either going to do this or I am going to divorce you. And then the husband then, capitulates to his wife in whatever way. Ultimately, the marriage is quote unquote saved. But now we've created a situation where the church, the pastor still wants to say the husband is responsible for everything because he's in charge. However, effectively what we've got is the husband has to do what his wife wants, or else she will pull the trigger and divorce him. And we were talking about this just before the stream started, but to give an example, anybody who went to youth group in the late 2000s probably watched the movie Fireproof. And this was a supposedly Christian movie that a lot of churches at the time just said, oh, this is such a beautiful picture of Christian marriage. And yet, for those that have seen the movie, you'll know that basically what happens is there's a couple where the husband and the wife aren't agreeing on a lot of things. The wife threatens to divorce the husband. The husband begs and kvetches and capitulates to his wife's every demand. And then in the end, she gets everything she wants. He gets nothing he wants. And she decides he's the man for her after all. And their marriage is saved. But the lesson most women learned, at least as far as I can see, is that if your husband's not doing what you want, threaten divorce, you'll get your way. So when it comes to responsibility, yes, I believe both parties contribute. But at the end of the day, if we're going to say the husband is responsible for the marriage, that also implies that the wife has an obligation to obey him, even if she disagrees. If we're going to say it's the other way around, well, then we can't create a situation where we want to say the husband is the head and he ultimately has responsibility, but the wife can disobey him whenever she wants. And if he doesn't sufficiently please her, she can pull the trigger and divorce him. And I feel like a lot of marriages today, even the ones that stay together, are effectively the latter, where although we want to say the husband's in charge because he's responsible for everything, not the wife, it's really the wife pulling the strings because she's the one who can pull the trigger with divorce, and he'd better obey or risk losing his reputation.
I mean, we agreed on this before the stream, but I think Fireproof is an insane view of marriage. B, I don't really think that we can say that most marriages that are together are the wife just, threatening divorce and having her husband by the balls. I would say that any marriage where divorce is, being brought up as kind of a stick to hit someone over the head with, there's no way that's going to last very long. Let's be honest. The idea that these lifelong marriages are just the wife going, I'm going to leave you. If you do one more thing, I'm going to leave you. I don't think that anything would last that long. No man is, no self-respecting man is going to stay that way. I don't think.
You'll be surprised, especially, I would say I can, again, all I can offer you is my experience in that I've lived a lot of places. I've been to a lot of church. I've seen a lot of husbands go to great lengths to quote unquote save their marriages. And when you see them interacting, they look terrified of their wives. And again,
I'm not rejecting the idea that exists. I don't think that it's probable that that's the norm. I do think that, as we mentioned before, there are certain church communities that are kind of trying to scramble, and I would put Fireproof and that blog by that pastor kind of in this bucket. They're trying to scramble to correct for a couple decades of kind of telling women that they just didn't submit enough, and that's why their marriage fell apart. I don't think either of these are correct ways of viewing it. You can't just say that, well, if he cheated on you, maybe you weren't doing what you were supposed to do. Or if she threatens divorce, maybe you're not leading the husband correctly.
Well, I see, and sorry to interrupt, but I just want there's the point. At the end of the day, what I think what we need to bring back is every person is responsible for the decisions they make. If a woman chooses to divorce her husband, now she can tell me all she wants about what a horrible person he was. At the end of the day, it was your choice to divorce. You have to own it. If the husband cheated on his wife, he can talk all he wants about how she didn't submit to him or was denying him sex or whatever. Again, at the end of the day, it was your choice to cheat. You have to own that choice, regardless of what the other person did. And I think a lot. Again, we can argue about anecdotal experience or not, but a lot of the women who I've personally talked to, both in person and online, who divorced their husbands, they always seem to have this view: it's not my fault that we got divorced. He made me divorce him because he did this or that. And my response is always, well, what if an abusive husband who actively beats his wife made the argument, it's not my fault that I hit her. She was being a horrible wife. If she didn't want me to hit her, she shouldn't have been such a horrible wife. I mean, we have to accept it's at the end of the day, you are responsible for the choices you make, regardless of what someone else does.
Yeah, 100%. And that's kind of where I was going with it, is I think that saying that it's just on women to submit properly or it's just on men to lead properly neglects the fact that it is both of their jobs to do both of their biblical roles. I think this is one of the reasons that I often kind of come back to Christianity, because I think that it's one thing to say that we just need like proper legal incentives for everybody, but ultimately, if those are fine once it comes down to actual, divorce at the end of the day, but way before that, in the actual marriage, I think it does matter that we have a, cultural and religious framework for what that relationship looks like. But yeah, everyone is 100% responsible for their conduct and what they ultimately end up doing. But I don't know. I mean, I think that this idea that the solution is then just to kind of swear off marriage and say, well, I can't tell any women apart and they are all equally bad. I think I hear this. I grew up hearing this a lot more from feminists, of saying, men these days are awful and they're irredeemable. And like, look at all these horrible stories of all these women who've been beaten by their boyfriends and killed by their boyfriends. And like, would you reach into an M&M jar if 1 in 6 were poisoned? And like, that's how many women get sexually assaulted or whatever. And it's just so crazy, because it kind of insults your own intelligence to say that you are completely blind, or that completely blind choosing a partner, that it's like reaching into a bag of M&Ms. And I think that that's equally true when, especially like the new wave feminists are saying, well, you can't tell men apart and they just snap one day and kill you. Like, I'm sorry, that's just not true. Most highly abusive people, especially like physically abusive, displayed some red flags beforehand. And I do think that's the same case often for a lot of women who are, hyper promiscuous or not very good at fidelity, or just not committed to the marriage. Honestly, the main thing that I've realized talking to a lot of divorced people is that there were some signs at some point, often before they got married. Even if it's talking to their friends will often say things like, they always were a little bit of a hot mess, but he had to learn the hard way, or she had to just, try things, and she wouldn't have listened to us anyway. I think that's kind of why dating in community is such a huge factor. Your parents should be weighing in on this. Your family members and friends and pastors and, religious community should be weighing in on this. One person might be able to fool you, but the odds that they're fooling everyone in your life are pretty slim. Granted, it does happen. I mean, you hear about like the crazy serial killers and everyone goes, we never could have known. But oftentimes there is that one friend that was like, well, he had this weird habit of chewing on fingers. And you're like, oh, okay. So there were a couple red flags. Again, I'm not saying that it's everyone's job to like mind read what their partner will do in the future, but the idea that it's like completely at random, I don't know. I think that swearing off people entirely is kind of shooting yourself in the foot, and it's premature.
Okay, and I would agree. I don't think it's entirely random, but again, I would say I approach this from a risk management standpoint. And what I see traditional conservatives, and for example, just some of your the tweets you've made, and I'll pull one of them up here. It seems to me, and again from my perspective, the conservative viewpoint is that even though divorce is a risk, we need to focus specifically on what men can do to mitigate the risk of divorce. For example, the one I hear all the time, well, just marry a good Christian girl and go to church weekly, and that cuts the risk of divorce in half. Well, yes, granted, you can say that statistically couples that attend church weekly are half as likely to divorce as couples who don't, but clearly there still are some couples who divorce, so that in and itself is not removing the risk of divorce. And sorry, I just, as a security professional who does risk management a lot, the way any type of risk, what you'll learn in professional risk management is there are essentially 5 things you can do with the risk. You can avoid it, which is one way or another, you make it so that the risk no longer affects you. You can accept it and just basically move forward, accepting the risk as it is. You can mitigate it, which is take actions that make the risk less likely to occur, but don't remove it entirely. You can spread it, which is not really relevant in this situation, but one way or another, it would be, create multiple assets that if you lose one, you don't lose the other, or you can transfer it, which again, that's more of a professional circumstance and not something that would apply to marriage. But as a man looking from the outside in, what I see is that the conservative community is just saying, men, you just got to man up. Look at all these things you as a man can do that statistically lower the likelihood of divorce. Well, not at all putting any burden on the woman to actually step forward and do something to mitigate her role in what happens. And what I would say here is what I really firmly believe, if women were people on all sides, red pill, conservative, or just, even feminists who see this as a good thing, people agree marriage rates are going down. Every passing year, we see fewer and fewer people are getting married. We also see those that are getting married older. The average first age of marriage in 2023, I think, was 30, and it shows no signs of going back down. So the question is, if this isn't working, what do we need to do to get men and women, either way, to start getting married again? Well, as a man, what I see is I'm being told, yeah, you disproportionately bear all the risk, but tough, you got to do it. You have to work even harder to mitigate the risk of divorce. What I'm saying is I firmly believe if we actually focus on putting actual consequences on women, and especially if within the conservative movement, if women within the conservative movement got on board with this, I think a lot more would happen. And what I have often suggested is, all right, let's bring up the issue of either private marriage contracts, vice, state-sanctioned marriage, or prenuptial agreements. And now on the latter, I want to point out a lot of people rightly would say immediately, wait, prenuptial agreements aren't a good thing because you're effectively planning for a divorce, and that makes it more likely that that the marriage will end in divorce. And I would say I would agree if a prenuptial agreement is effectively something along the lines of, if we get divorced, this belongs to me, this belongs to me, this belongs to me, and it's more or less one person trying to protect themselves in the event of divorce. On the other hand, let's suppose we had a prenuptial agreement that says, in the event of divorce, the party that initiates the divorce, regardless of reason, shall forfeit the right to any marital property, any child custody, and any type of alimony or child care payments. Now, granted, in the legal system today, I'm not even sure such an agreement would hold up. But the point is, suppose a couple that's planning on getting married comes forward, we go through this legal process, and we actually start making women sign, well, and men for that matter, but I think they already face a disproportionate amount of risk. We make women sign on the dotted line. If you're going to agree to get married, you're also agreeing that in the event that you ever divorce your husband, you get nothing. He keeps 100% of the marital property, child custody, everything, or heck, even impose financial penalties on the party who wants to leave. Now, whenever I say that, I have generally found conservative women get really angry, and they'll say, that's absolutely ridiculous. What if the man's abusive? What if this? What if that? They come up with a million reasons of why they need to maintain their right to divorce. And my question then becomes, wait a minute, you said you don't believe in divorce. You think it's that marriage is till death do us part. Yet what I'm saying is, let's impose, if you really mean that, let's impose consequences on the party that actually seeks a divorce in the event that it happens, and they suddenly have a problem with it. And this is where I would bring up something, the difference between a promise and a guarantee. Now, I learned this from a security expert by the name of Gavin DeBecker, but basically how he defines the difference between a promise and a guarantee is, in a guarantee, there's some kind of compensation. When you make an agreement, there's some kind of compensation if the other party fails to deliver, i.e., you take a loan from the bank. If you fail to repay the loan, the contract spells out what consequences you face if you fail to uphold your terms of the agreement. On the other hand, a promise, if somebody just says, I promise not to do this, well, a year later, if they do it, if you have no actual legal contract, you can say, but Your Honor, they said the words I promise, and that may or may not mean anything because you didn't have an actual legal guarantee in place. So what if we had, if it really is the case that conservatives say we don't believe in divorce, we believe divorce never should happen, couples should always try to work out their problems vice leaving, why would it be a problem to say we should actually impose actual consequences on the part tries to divorce, whether that's the man or the woman?
Okay, wow, there's a lot there.
It's all right. I know I tend to be long-winded.
No, you're fine. I should have been taking notes. So I don't really have a problem imposing some form of consequences on the party that, initiates it. I think, one, I'm not a legal expert in this domain. I don't really think that that's probably feasible under current prenuptial laws, at least in most states. I'm sure it would vary probably, but I don't think that that's probably true. Two, there is evidence that says that having a prenuptial agreement does causally influence your odds of divorce. So I would push back slightly on that. And I think we kind of come back to some of the same, maligned incentives that if you really want someone to not make your life a living hell, honestly, what you're incentivizing is the fact that people know that no one can push back on them. I mean, I've had more than one friend get married and have their partner just be constantly cheating, whether that's the man or the woman. In that case, I don't know if you'd want the incentive for them to be able to just do that as they please or make your life hell, and know that there's nothing they can do about it. I also, honestly, I don't think that kind of having state consequences should really be, I guess, a substitute for having our own morals. I think that in general, things work a lot better when the state incentives are reflecting the morals of folks. So I guess, I don't entirely disagree in theory. I just don't really see how this is an effective thing to focus on, mostly on a public policy angle. And the reason that I tweet the way that I do, the reason that I focus more on what people can do, I do not exclusively tweet about only what men can do. I do tend to tweet towards men because men are, the ones who typically decide whether or not to get married. And because Twitter is mostly male and most of my followers are male. But I would completely reject the premise that I don't talk about what women can do. I absolutely do. They tend to not get boosted by the algorithm nearly as much because they don't, make you guys as angry. But they, tend to be out there with their little 12 likes or whatever. So no, I do think that it matters what both sexes do. I do think that both sexes have responsibilities to avoid divorce. I don't think being super heavy-handed and trying to impose consequences, I'm not morally opposed to it. I just don't think it's particularly effective. I don't think it's going to happen as far as the courts go. And I think that people focusing their energies on policy change that is highly unlikely and, kind of not well supported by the general population. I don't think that that's really an effective way to take the day-to-day marriage debate. I think people tend to be happier, and I think they tend to have higher self-efficacy when they focus on what they can actually do in their own lives rather than going, wouldn't this policy change be nice? I think as far as if we were talking about repealing no-fault divorce or imposing consequences or whatever, a very good example for this would be the amount of time that it took people or that it took the country to even get rid of Roe v. Wade. That was 50 freaking years. And Roe v. Wade, I think we can all probably, I would hope, agree, had much, much higher consequences than, say, no-fault divorce or the current family courts.
Well, more lives lost, definitely. I would say broken families are having quite a bit of societal consequence, and the termination of pregnancies is definitely interrelated with that. But yes, I would agree.
But we're talking 60 million lives lost. That's insane. And as horrible as divorce is, I mean, I spent 20 years growing up in family court. It's awful. People actually tend to be better off post-divorce than they would be if they had never gotten married at all. And they certainly aren't dead. I mean, I think that, and so just taking, Roe v. Wade versus Dobbs, and granted, this was 50 years of this being really like a primary goal of the conservative movement. Most people were on board with ending Roe v. Wade. We finally got Dobbs, and let's be honest, abortion is still legal. It is still legal in some form in all 50 states. We didn't freaking win. We had a small win, but it took 50 years and basically nothing got accomplished. Meanwhile, you have giant marches. You have people for whom this is a singular policy priority. My grandma only votes based on her pro-life priorities. And that's the amount of progress we got done. If you had started a similar movement backed by FedSoc, backed by every conservative piece of the movement in the entire country, if you had started something with no-fault divorce in the same year, a man in 1970, when Reagan brought it into effect in California, would be retired, alone, and have 0 children by now had he waited on the divorce laws to be fixed in the way that Roe v. Wade was. And let's be honest, it has less popular support and less policy likelihood of happening that we magically fix the divorce laws. I am here for fixing the family courts. I am here for incremental progress. We can also do 2 things at once, but I think focusing explicitly on the policy environment rather than on what people can do in their own lives, and saying, listen, even if 1 in a million women are wife material, and maybe it is that low, maybe 1 in a million men are actually husband material, okay, go find them. That is a much more useful thing to do with your time than to lobby for change, or do both. You can 100% do both. Go on a date, go lobby at night. I don't know. But that's genuinely why I try to focus my energy on kind of effectual things and life choices that you can make. Because I don't know about you, I am not like super, super well connected in Washington. I think they're kind of all corrupt anyway. And I don't think that most of our Congress members are going to vote for something that says that they can't divorce their spouses. Those people cheat on their spouses and divorce them like it's their freaking job. And a lot of them aren't doing a whole lot in Congress.
Unfortunately, there's a whole divorce industry now. And I mean, I'm not going to get into the specifics here.
That's also true.
You can listen to lawyers talk about how divorce is essentially a racket. There's a whole industry that makes money on people divorcing. So I don't think they're going to want to get rid of it. I guess the point I'm making is you're right. On an individual level, I can't do anything about public policy. However, if I choose to get married, I have control over what I do. And at the end, but I don't have control over ultimately, I don't have control over what my future wife does. So the way I'm approaching this is, if suppose I'm dating someone, we're discussing the possibility of getting married, and she tells me that I believe in a biblical view of marriage. I believe once you say I do, the marriage should only be dissolved by death. You're in it for life. You can't divorce. A wife can't divorce her husband. A husband can't divorce his wife. And I say, okay, well then why don't we actually put some oomph behind that? Let's go through the legal process of creating a prenup, not for me to protect what's mine from you, not for you to protect what's yours from me, but for us to say we really believe that, and in fact we feel so strongly about it that we're willing to impose consequences on ourselves if we ever try to divorce. Now, if she is resistant to that, what that tells me is that despite what she may say, she sees divorce as an option and she wants to keep it in her pocket just in case. Now, I know in this discussion, people always bring, oh, but what if this, what if that, what if the husband's abusive? What if the spouse cheats? With something or that. I will just say, I am much more likely to believe if there's a legal prenup in place, whether it gets held up in court or not, if they were actually willing to go through that process with you before getting married, I am much more likely to believe that for that person, it really was as bad as they say it is. If they were willing to get divorced, knowing that there would be consequences or that they might walk away with nothing. On the other hand, in these situations where the woman is so adamant, oh, my husband was abusive, he did this, he did that, and oh yeah, by the way, I'm getting the house and full custody of the kids and alimony and child support. It's like you have to ask yourself, would she have been so gung-ho to do it if she had actually faced consequences? And in that regard, yes, I understand. The prenup, because of our legal system, the prenup may or may not hold up in court. My point is the willingness to actually go through that process and say, I am willing to impose consequences on myself if I ever try to do this, in my opinion, bolsters the truthfulness of that claim that they don't believe in divorce. If they say, I don't believe in divorce and I promise I will never divorce you, well, I mean, great, but I've heard plenty of stories from men who, when their wife said, I'm divorcing you, they tried to say, on our wedding day, we vowed till death do us part. What did you mean? And her answer is, I meant it at the time. Well, obviously the words don't hold any force, but it means a lot more if she's willing to say, yeah, I'm willing to accept the consequences.
I mean, I think it sounds like the male version of excuse my language, but like a shit test where women are like, okay, he says he loves me, but if he really loved me, he would do this. I think honestly, if you kind of can't tell the difference between somebody like just paying you lip service and their actual beliefs, like you probably don't know them well enough to get married, is what I would genuinely say. I think conservatives often mean well by saying like, okay, when you know, just get married after 6 months, whatever. I think that we probably should be a lot more discerning than that. I'm not genuinely like, if you sit down with your, future fiance and go, okay, like, here's what I'm thinking. And that's a conclusion that you both come to. I'm not anti that. I just think that in general, it kind of comes off to the woman. Like it's like a woman going up to you and saying, okay, if you're not cheating on me, then show me your phone. It's like, it's acting as though the default, it's acting as though there is no default. And the default is there is not a prenup. The default is you don't get my phone and my password. The fact that we're kind of treating these as though there's like no option, I think is a little bit fallacious, but I'm not anti, like if a couple wants to do that, I guess, whatever. I think ultimately though, it's fine. I think requiring it is a little strange. And I would much rather someone that I don't have to do that with.
I'm not saying I would demand that other couples do this. Like I said, at the end of the day, so long as you are doing what you want because you've decided that's what's best for you, fine. I guess I'm coming at the position of, and I see where you're going with the show me your phone thing. But on one level, I think there is legitimacy to that, in that if someone has, if you have legitimate reason to think that your partner may be cheating, if they are unwilling to provide evidence to the contrary, that is a red flag in my mind, whether it's coming from the man or the woman. And again, I would say, I can't think, if the person claims there's no legitimate reason to divorce, I would never do that. I mean, saying it is one thing. Being willing to, but again, I would say there's a difference between a promise and a guarantee. A guarantee actually offers some kind of compensation if one party to the agreement fails to live up to their side of the agreement. But if a person just says the words "I promise," I mean, there's no. It's to quote Gavin DeBecker, it's like promises are the hollowest instrument of human speech, and by that he means whenever somebody says "I promise," it doesn't really change. It doesn't really impose any consequence on them for breaking that promise. It just shows they want to convince you that what they're saying is true. And
sure, right. But I mean, I think all of this kind of assumes and this is, I think, a huge, huge red pill talking point, is the idea that divorce is this huge payday for women. I mean, you were rattling off things like, oh, alimony and all this stuff. Most people don't get alimony. Most women don't keep the house. Most women only keep the kids full time if the man didn't fight for them. And a vast majority of the time, he doesn't even try to. I'm not saying that the family court is perfect. I do think that it is biased against men in some ways. But most women are much financially worse off after marriage than the man, and they're much worse financially off than they would have been in the marriage. I mean, sure, we talk about her keeping the house or keeping alimony or whatever, or child support or what have you. But if she were married, she had even more than that, because she had her stuff plus his stuff. Okay. I think this idea that women have this huge financial incentive is just, I mean, it's a completely false premise that we're arguing from. And that's kind of what this is all based on, is the idea that women have a giant incentive to leave. They simply do not.
Well, I would disagree. Even if we remove the financial question, I would disagree with the incentive to leave, in that, again, from what and this isn't, I'm not claiming I can objectively prove this, but what I've seen is if a woman leaves, there are hundreds of other women, particularly in Christian communities, that will rally around her and praise her for getting out of an abusive situation. They'll provide her all the emotional support and love she could possibly need, and anything she says will be assumed by default to be true. Meanwhile, the husband now is put in the position where he's by default has to defend himself because if any church community he goes to now, if they find out he's divorced, in all likelihood, he's not going to be allowed to serve in that church in any capacity. Any claims she made about him are going to be by default assumed to be true unless he can conclusively prove otherwise, and his reputation is going to suffer. And again, you don't have to agree, but I mean, that's the way I see it.
I mean, but like, okay, even if we're just talking socially, yeah, a woman is going to get, propped up by her friends who she was probably already getting propped up by for every single decision she's ever made. That's like how a lot of female friendships are, which is not a good thing. I wouldn't say, but I mean, so what? So what? Like, I have not met a divorced woman who isn't, I mean, sure, I think some of them, if they made a truly correct decision and the guy was like genuinely abusive, I think of Hillary Crowder, you can tell she's like got very high degree of mental clarity because she's realizes that she left somebody who was screaming at her all the time. But most divorced women, especially when they did it for really selfish reasons, are freaking miserable. If you're that miserable of a person in a marriage, it doesn't get better when you leave. I mean, those are the people uploading giant Facebook selfie albums while they're doing their wine night, like trying to convince themselves that they're super sexy and super hot. If you were that self-centered when you were married, I just don't think that it's this happy rainbows thing after you leave. I don't know. I have not met divorced women who are like super affirmed and loving life and super confident after they leave. They might be initially, they might like have, a stupid divorce party with their friends and celebrate it and go, oh, he was such a jerk, wasn't he? Sure. I mean, that happens after every divorce, right? Like men do that sometimes with their friends after their divorce. And then the smoke clears and the hangover subsides and you go, oh my God, I just tanked my marriage. I don't think that even if they get the benefit of the doubt that they are actively better off. And I certainly don't think that that sort of affirmation is an incentive for them to like actually ruin their lives. I do believe that women encourage each other to divorce way more often than they should. I'm not saying like break up with your friends if they just got divorced, but like you should probably very consciously think about.
I would say I would. Studies have been done on this, but divorce tends to spread like a wildfire. In that, in groups of women that are close friends, if one woman divorces her husband, the likelihood that the women in her friend group will also divorce her husband goes up significantly. Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I'm just saying that like I wouldn't, if my friend gets divorced, I'm not going to say, all right, well, never talking to you again. But I probably would honestly consider like how close we are on some of those levels. I would probably try and pull her into my marriage and other actual healthy marriages. And I do make a conscious effort to, I'm dating at this point. My boyfriend and I are not married yet, but we do make a conscious effort to surround ourselves with our families and with other folks who have like wholesome, healthy marriages. So I agree with you. It does matter. And I think that if you have friends, especially while you're dating, I think you can vet your friends for this long before you get married. If your friends are constantly trying to get you to come up with stuff that's wrong with your boyfriend, she's not a good friend. She shouldn't be your bridesmaid. She shouldn't be your friend after you're married. But I think those kind of like nasty women, if to use a Trump term, I guess, rear their ugly heads long before you guys are, wife friends. Okay. Well, and like I said, we can just, I'm just to be honest, I don't agree with your assertion that women don't have a financial incentive. I think, it's different from case to case, although I think, I think largely it's not primarily the financial incentive I'm concerned about. Now, I would like to bring up this comment from my friend Wintry Knight. He says, I think listening to this and understanding what the perspective of Christian women is on the threats facing men, you just understand there is no reason to get married. And I kind of echo the sentiment there in that again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like what you're saying is women don't really have an incentive to divorce. Therefore, if they do divorce, they must have had at least a semi-good reason for it. And therefore, the men that find their lives destroyed, who find themselves contemplating suicide, their reputation's ruined, they really shouldn't be all that concerned. It's not that bad. I mean, I know those weren't your words exactly.
That's not what I'm saying at all. No. A lot of people divorce for completely idiotic reasons. They absolutely do. I'm just saying that this idea that we need to even out incentives isn't true. And I mean, I think that there are lots of things to fix in family courts. I think there are things to fix as far as divorce goes. But I think it's often painted as like women are just like in a marriage, women have to hold themselves back from this crazy good payday, and life could be so good for them if they just left the marriage. And I just don't think that that's an accurate take.
Okay, and fair enough. I would say every case has to be evaluated on its own merits, and I agree. Sure. Not every divorce is a case where a woman will receive a massive payday if she divorces her husband. However, I would say that because of the way our society is structured, she certainly won't have to worry about whether she can provide for herself, even if she was married to a deadbeat who made no money. We have social welfare programs in place that will ensure that her and her children are cared for. We have, social society net. We have, church communities, friend communities, what have you, that will universally come to her aid and reassure her that she was right in her decision, and that she must have had. I still see
It's just isn't true. I'm so sorry. It's just not true.
Okay. Well, I mean, we can disagree on this point, but I mean, is it your opinion that women, by and large, will be shamed and do you believe women that divorce face real consequences that would disincentivize them from doing it? Therefore, the majority of women who divorce must have had really good reasons because they were willing to go through all these horrible things, and nonetheless they had to get out. Is that your position?
Everything after therefore, I do not believe. I do believe women face real consequences. I do not think that means that every divorce they had good reasons. Those like that is a non sequitur, and I would never argue that women have good reasons because they divorce. I do think that they actually do face consequences. I think men and women both face consequences for divorcing. I think men and women, by and large, are idiots, and a lot of them make really idiotic decisions. I think a lot of women make idiotic decisions and leave marriages. I think a lot of men make idiotic decisions and leave marriages. But everybody genuinely does have incentives to stay in a marriage, with rare exceptions. I mean, maybe there's like crazy gold diggers and whatever, but like the vast majority of us have incentives to stay in marriage. The vast majority of us make stupid decisions.
Okay. All right. Well, fine. I guess we're going to have to disagree on this point, but I will say where I look at from this as a man is I can vet women, and I think if you want to get married, you should. But the reality of the situation is, in the society in which we live, at the end of the day, I can only control what I do. I can't control what someone else does. When you get married, either the man or the woman has the ability to divorce you, and legally you can't stop them. And whatever consequences come from that, you're going to have to face. Now, do I, as a man, believe that it's worth the risk? I mean, I'm just going to be honest. I'm going to say I don't think so, especially having seen a lot of men in my life go through divorce. I don't want to have to face that. And I think a lot of other men feel the same. And I can't particularly blame more and more men for saying, I don't want to get married unless we do something about this. And if other men feel differently, fine. But I think we can see that the marriage rate is going down. And despite the large push, I would say, in the TradCon community, when we've got people like Ben Shapiro, Matt Walsh, all these other mainstream commentators putting out podcasts trying to refute the red pill, telling men they need to just keep getting married. Well, all the while, there's really no push to actually address what the issues, the reasons they say they're not getting married.
I think we should address those. I also think, and this is probably where maybe some of the risk management lens is less helpful. What a lot of this treats the null hypothesis as is that like everything is fine if you don't get married. The reality is, we talk a lot about like how men are more likely to, off themselves if they get divorced. They are actually less likely to off themselves if they get divorced than they would be had they never gotten married. They are better off divorced than never married. And so I think that when we kind of compare the worst possible outcome of divorce with the best possible outcome of MGTOW or whatever you want to call it. The idea that it's just, well, everything is going to be fine. And then like you take this risk by getting married, you are also taking a risk by not getting married. Statistically, you will not live as long. You will not be as healthy. You will not be as happy. You will not be as fulfilled, and you will not be as financially well off by not getting married.
Okay,
I think that people don't understand that it is a risk to not get married as well. And we treat it as though like it's a marriage or you get to chill and be as happy as you were at 20 something. When the reality is, if you know a lot of men who've never gotten married, maybe some of them who post in like the MGTOW subreddit or whatever, like really want to make it sound like they're banging hot babes every week. A lot of them are freaking miserable. A lot of divorced guys remarry because they didn't find it that bad. A lot of divorced guys say that they would do it again. Something like 90% of them would like a second shot with their spouse, or they would be happy to try it over from the beginning. I think the null hypothesis is much more dangerous than we make it out to be. And if we're doing an actual risk assessment, we should be, I think, considering it in a way that is different than a happy 30-year-old guy who is having a perfectly fine time, because at 30 he is. At 60, he's much, much, much more likely to off himself, even than if he had divorced and failed.
Okay. And there I would again say, we can say statistically single men are more likely to commit suicide than divorced men. I'd want to break down, of those single men that commit suicide, what are the reasons that they do it? And are there any actions single men can take to mitigate that? And I would say yes, especially when you're single. Again, I can control the decisions I make. I can't control decisions other people make. And for those that commit suicide, I mean, people commit suicide for a lot of different reasons. Generally, what I've observed is people who commit suicide because of something that was outside their control. Because if it was within their control, and therefore it had something to do with someone else, again, I certainly can't prove that. You got to look at every individual case. But with a lot of these things, talking points, and in the Trent Horn-Pearl debate that was just on recently, he brought these up too. Married men live longer. Married men make more money. Married men report being happy more often. Well, the last one I'm not really that concerned about, because happiness isn't something I can quantify. You can say sure. 80% of men report being happy in their marriages. Okay, great. What I'd be more concerned about is look at any 80% of those men. Would I trade places with them? I mean, I look at a lot of men who are married and I say, absolutely not. Now, they might say I'm happy, but again, that's not something I can quantify. They make more money. Well, maybe, but you also have to know married men tend to need more money because they're providing for their wives and their family. A single man can get by. Aaron Clary has made a joke about this in a lot of his books, but he'll post on his Twitter a picture of like a studio apartment with a mattress and an Xbox.
The folding chair.
Say, this is what a man needs. So single men make less money. Well, yeah, oftentimes single men don't need as much money, so they choose to spend their time doing whatever hobbies they will. But where I'm going with this is statistically, you can say like those things in and of themselves, you can't prove that because it was being married that caused them to make more money. It was being married that caused them to live longer. Now, on that point, I think it has more to do with if you have children. And as someone who used to work as a hospital security director, I can say I have some insight into this. I think old single people die sooner because they have no children to take care of them, not necessarily because they were married per se. But that's a separate point. It's just marry a woman, any woman, and instantly it increases the chances that you live longer, make more money, and are happier. I don't think that's the case. You again have to analyze why that happens more often for married men, and is it the case that single men can't replicate that in their lives by making different choices? So I guess my point is those things in and of themselves don't really incline me, and I think by and large they don't incline men to say, oh, okay, great, despite the risks, I better get married because I'll make more money and I'll live longer and I'll be happier. Those just seem too vague to me, especially considering the risks that men do, the risks you face. And again, ultimately every person's got to make the decision, cost versus benefit analysis. Do the benefits outweigh the risks? Well, it seems to me traditional conservative side is banging on this. married men live longer, married men make more money, married men are reporting higher, and average men are saying great, but that doesn't assuage my concerns, and they're not under obligation to do so. And if it's already not working, then I don't think preaching more of the same is going to reverse the societal trend.
I mean, I think, but we're kind of coming back to the idea that it's just like marriage or a very safe null hypothesis. I mean, we're kind of, you have to compare two different risks. And if we want to talk about it in that lens, like there are higher risks to not getting married than to getting married. That's just simply true. Now I agree that like just kind of parroting the same talking points isn't super helpful, but if we're parroting the same talking points about risks of marriage, we should probably be parroting the same ones that say that marriage has fewer risks than not getting married. I don't think that everyone has to get married. I don't necessarily think that everyone should. I think especially if you're serving God, that there's plenty of fantastic singles out there who truly do discern and go for the single life. And I think that's genuinely awesome. What I see in a lot of the sort of like red pill and red pill adjacent sphere is that it's not that they discerned that marriage wasn't what they wanted. It's that deep down, you can tell these guys would get married if they didn't think the risks were so high. And they have a really, 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 truly distorted risk calculus where they think that there are zero risks to not getting married and that there are all the risks to getting married. That is my only point, and that's the only reason that I bring those stats up, is that like there is a much higher than zero risk to not getting married. And yeah, I mean, if you pick any woman at random, your life is not necessarily going to be better with her. That is 100% true. The awesome part is you're not picking a woman at random. It's not Hunger Games where they just like pick a woman out of a hat for you. Thank God. I certainly wouldn't want them to pick out a man from a hat for me. I don't think that everybody has to get married. I think that what I hear from a lot of these folks is that they're kind of like saying that they're going their own way and then living their entire lives online, hyper focused on the opposite sex. I think women do this a lot too with like the rad femme accounts. If you actually don't want your life to be influenced by the opposite sex, like I don't want to say log off. I'm certainly quite online, obviously. But I mean, okay, then just do that. Like we don't have to focus on all this like sour grapes post hoc justification of like justifying your decision. If you were actually happy, I'm not saying you specifically, but like if a lot of these people were actually happy, they wouldn't be obsessing over what they couldn't have. I think a lot of young men seem as though they really do want marriage. They just don't think it's possible. And they just don't think that they can achieve that. And I don't say that like, oh, they suck or like they can't cut it. But I think that they don't think it's possible in like our current society, or that there just aren't the women, or there just isn't the legal framework. And that's really where I'm coming from. It's not the people who truly want to be single. It's the ones that want to be married and think that it's not possible. That's really who I want to reach.
Okay. And fair enough. And I think you make a valid point in that, you know, if you're constantly raging about something, there is a fair question to be asked about, is the person really happy? I always take the position of, and it's just, as an aside, I dislike bringing the conversation to this point, because I think a lot of times in debates about this, especially if you're coming from a red pill manosphere side of things, you bring up a point and the immediate response of the person you're talking to is, you're just saying that because nobody wants to marry you, or you're just saying that because you're an incel. And it goes on to like
yeah, it's so crappy.
Like maybe that's true, but the point is, like, what you said is either true or false. If you think it's false, point out why. Like maybe it is the case that I'm just bitter and angry that I can't get married. But even if that's true, that doesn't make what I've said false. Let's focus on what we're actually talking about, not a psychoanalysis of why I'm saying what I'm saying. And the same goes.
Totally agree.
Yeah, and the same can go for women. You could say, you know, your standards are too. You just say that because your standards are too high. You're a Chad chaser or whatever they want to say. Ultimately, what you said was true or false. Let's focus on that. But
yeah, I think that's a great point for honestly any engagement on social media.
I guess I'm just where I'm at is Is it possible? Yes, I believe it is possible. I think if there was more, and what I think we'll kind of wrap it up here and then move to conversations. My point is, I think if there was more focus on women doing things to show men that they are serious about staying together and divorce isn't an option, more men would be more likely to come forward and pursue marriage. But I think most men, rightly or wrongly, and again, we can disagree on some points. I've got my experience, you've got your experience, and ultimately everybody's got to make their own decision based on what they believe is best for them. But I think most men, the way they see it, what they are being told is, if it's their responsibility to make the marriage succeed. If the marriage fails, by definition, it was their fault, because the woman, surely she wouldn't have left if you hadn't messed something up. And basically they see they're in a lose-lose situation where it's no matter what happens, it's going to be their fault. And maybe, maybe it'll work out, maybe it won't. But again, would you be put in would you like to get in a car as the passenger and be told you're ultimately responsible for where the vehicle goes, when you're not ultimately the person driving the vehicle? That's the position modern men feel themselves to be.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is what I agree. That's how men feel. I kind of look at it as like co-CEOs of a company, or like co-founders of companies. You brought up, when we were kind of messaging back and forth, the idea that a lot of men are told, like, just marry the right person and then everything will be easy. And you said, you compared it to like saying, okay, just buy low and sell high in the stock market. It's that easy. And I think that kind of gets back to this idea of like, it's simple, but it's not easy. But I don't know. I mean, I think marriage is much closer to a car than the stock market. But if we're using the stock market analogy, like you're right, that if we're talking about like efficient market hypothesis, at least, like you have exactly zero chance of beating the market. If we're talking in econ terms. Sorry to bring back your earlier
just to give everyone an explanation of where we're going from this. I think the point I was making is, a lot of men are told, and to give an example, on my channel, I did an analysis of Ben Shapiro's podcast. Me and Night Shift reviewed his argument that his podcast, where he quote unquote refutes the red pill. And his whole argument, he basically acknowledged, he said, yes, no fault divorce is bad. Yes, men disproportionately bear the risks of divorce. That's true. But it's okay. Just marry the right person. Just go to church with your spouse every week, and that lowers the chance of divorce. And just do this, that lowers the chance of divorce. And my point is, I compared that to, there are a lot of scammers online that will teach you can get super rich by investing in the stock market. Well, how? It's pretty easy. Buy low and sell high. And that's how you make tons of money in the stock market. Now, technically, that's true. If you buy low and sell high, you will make money. And indeed, it is that principle that investors use when they're making money. But any professional investor will tell you it's not so simple as you just understand that principle and you start investing and you make a ton of money. A lot more difficult than it sounds. And I think, yeah.
But it's more like investing in your own company, because you guys are co-founders. I mean, there's a reason that CEOs hold on to so much equity. Like, they know that they have a lot of ability to make their shares successful. Or unsuccessful, but as co-CEOs, you both have incentives to make the company super, super successful. So of course you guys both want shares in it. It's not like investing in somebody else's company. It's not like getting in somebody else's car or getting in an airplane or any of these other things. You guys are both driving. And I think you hear the car analogy actually in a lot of like biblical submission kind of analogies, where, you can't both be driving. Get somebody who's willing to sit in the passenger seat and not grab the steering wheel and, drive you off the road.
Okay. Which is great. But I think, again, that brings back to the analogy. I think the situation we're effectively in, if we're in a marriage where, even if I'm in the driver's seat, if the wife has the unilateral ability to kick me out of the car and take command of the vehicle at any time, which is what I see divorce as, then I can't ultimately be responsible. So, I think, but again, I've already said that. So, good discussion here. Night Shift, I'm going to go to the private chat quick. If you've saved any comments that you think we should reply to, by all means, go ahead and send those up now. Actually, and then I'm just going to quick scroll back through here and see if there are any that we should address. And I will put, I know there is a delay between us speaking and when the people that are in the chat right now actually hear it. So if you do have any questions that you posted earlier and you'd want us to answer, please re-put them back. Hang on, Night Shift, I'm going to add you in. This is Night Shift. My co-host has been monitoring the chat the entire time. I'm quickly, I know you don't know how to highlight. Were there any that you felt I should address that you saw come by? Or?
Well, I don't know. Hold on. Give me 1 minute. Nothing really stood out to me. Nothing huge really stood out to me, though. But you can, there wasn't really anything that stood out to me. There was a lot of arguing in the chat. I know that.
Well, I see that, but not really any questions for us. So
there wasn't really anything that I saw that stood out. JC Armitage towards the beginning had a really good question for Allie.
All right, let me go all the way to the top, and I will.
Now it's not letting me scroll to the top.
I see the will this be a discussion or a blood sport? So I guess you guys can weigh in.
Okay.
I don't know. He had a question about Allie or something.
Okay,
like that.
here we go.
Like,
I think I don't know who Allie is, but is she a feminist? Honest question. All right, I'll let you answer that, Allie.
I would say no, but I think kind of I get called a feminist a lot. I certainly don't think so. I think men and women are different. I don't think that means that they can be politically and economically equal. I do think that as a Christian, we have equal value as humans. I don't think that we're like some subspecies. If that makes me a feminist, okay. But no, I would not consider myself a feminist.
Okay. Well, what I would just say,
roles,
what I would say to that is, and I don't think you're a feminist in the traditional sense either, based on what you said. I think where a lot of red pill criticism of traditional conservatives calling them feminists is, what the red pill criticism of the average tradcon is usually that, well, they disagree with feminists on many major points, tradcons still, acknowledge it or not, effectively treat women as objects being acted upon. They do not hold women responsible for the choices they make. And the example I gave, the instinct, and again, you can say you don't believe this is really the case, although experience tells me otherwise, the instinct that conservative communities have for whenever a woman divorces her husband, the immediate assumption is he must have done something wrong to make her want to divorce him. Whereas in the reverse, they immediately assume he must be a bad man because he's shirking his responsibility to his wife. And just to give an example, in the movie Fireproof, which we mentioned, one quote from that movie that's always stuck with me is early on, the main male character who's trying to win back his wife's affection, his buddy at the fire department tells him, "Your wife is like a rose. Water her and give her sunshine, and she'll bloom. If she wants to leave you, you need to take a hard look at yourself and see what you're doing wrong." And I can't help but see that analogy reduces a woman to a plant. I mean, it's like she's just an object being acted upon. Everything she does is your fault, and she can't control it. And further, even the analogy even fails in as much as anybody who's ever had a garden, and believe me, I have a farm in the mountains here. Just doing everything right for a plant doesn't always guarantee it's going to bloom properly either. So,
yeah, no, I mean, I think if people view women as having zero agency, zero responsibility, etc., I don't even know if I would call that feminism, maybe, but it's idiotic. I certainly don't believe that. Okay. Do you understand that even if you choose a great Christian girl, there are risks for men who marry from the outside? For example, false accusations at work, being fired for Christian convictions. Yeah, I think I not only understand that, but I think the Bible teaches that. It says the world will hate you for my sake. I think that's part of being a Christian, marriage or not. I think if you're doing it right, you're not always going to be well liked. My old pastor is from Nigeria and had quite a few of his the people that he grew up with in his Christian community martyred. And when we used to complain about something like fasting, he would often say, Allie, they used to feed us to lions. Shut up and stop eating. And I think that honestly, like as a Christian, you kind of have to embrace suffering. I think it's just part of following Christ. Okay. I'm not saying that only men have to do that either. Like I think that women bear risks, certainly with something like childbirth. Yeah, you might die in childbirth. Like it's just kind of part of the game and part of the beauty of following Christ and being here on earth.
Okay. And I will say here, I'm just going to say his next comment. It's much easier to handle these threats as a single man who saves money rather when you have a much tighter margin due to wife and kids. I will just say Winter Night, I know from what he puts on his blog and having met him once in person, he is a single man who is doing quite well for himself. And even if it is the case that single men commit suicide at higher rate than divorced men, he is living proof that single men, by making the right choices, can be very happy and doing well in life. So shout out to Winter Night there.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Antonio Mosley, here's a question. You said you think not everyone should get married. So why are you concerned that most men are refusing to be with women? 60% of men throughout history never reproduce.
I mean, I think throughout history is probably not an ideal representation of when most people were most happy or fulfilled. I think, medieval peasants not reproducing are not like an ideal format for a happy man's life. I say that not everyone should get married just because I think biblically we're taught that, it's better to just follow Christ without doing that. It's a distraction for most. But I'm concerned because it's worse for everyone. I don't know. And people seem pretty miserable about it.
Okay.
Am I physically blind? People ask about my eyes all the time. Like I'm not blind. I can see. I had scarlet fever as a kid, so I don't have great vision, but no, I'm not like legally blind.
Okay. Although not directly related to marriage, still relevant enough to bring up, and that is the Duluth model of domestic abuse and false rape allegations. Okay, so I will handle this one just because I know I've made a video about this on my channel, The Truth About Domestic Abuse, if you ever want to check it out. But basically, the Duluth, in all domestic violence counseling, in the United States at least, and around the world, largely the model that is used by domestic violence counselors is something called the Duluth model. It was developed in Duluth, Minnesota in the 1980s. And basically, it was crafted by openly feminist researchers who admitted that their goal was not to put an end to actual physical abuse. It was to put women in charge of the household through force of law. And what you look at when you look at what's called the power and control wheel, which is the primary tool that is given to women to decide whether or not they're being abused by their husbands, effectively, it's so vague that any woman anywhere can claim she's being abused by her partner, and she will be right given the Duluth model. So I think this is something I've brought up, but I've always found, in my personal opinion, that when it comes to, especially in tradcon communities, if a woman divorces her husband, the magic word is abuse. All she has to do is claim he was abusing me, and she will be instantly showered with sympathy, love, care, and the husband will be assumed to be guilty no matter what. But I think it is rather egregious in that the way the model has been constructed, it's any woman anywhere for any reason can determine she's being abused. And just to give an example, one of the terms, and this is one of the best examples in my opinion, although there are others, one of the terms used is financial abuse. Men abuse their wives through financial abuse. And the question the woman is asked to decide whether or not she's being financially abused is, does your partner ever, 1, take your money, 2, make you ask for money, or 3, refuse to give you money? And if you stop and think about that for a minute, so if the husband takes his wife's money, that's abuse. But if she takes his money and he objects and says, honey, you have to ask me first, that's also abuse. And if she asks him for money and he says no, that's also abuse. So if you think about that for a minute, basically, in any situation where the woman doesn't have 100% control over the money in the relationship, she's being abused. And I think it shouldn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that's ridiculous. That's not. And if that's what financial abuse is, then literally any relationship except one where the wife has 100% control over the finances is financially abusive.
Yeah, no, I think honestly we see this even outside of marriage with a lot of the Me Too adjacent consent idea. I mean, you can say that it's not consent unless you're actively and verbally giving consent. But if you do that before, people have sex or whatever, and the person isn't actively consenting during sex, you can say, well, I wasn't consenting during sex. I changed my mind. I had a guy friend actually accused of exactly that, which was completely wild. And in her, account, the woman said effectively like, well, he kept asking, my consent and I kept giving it, but obviously I didn't enjoy myself is effectively what it boiled down to, which was completely insane. And ultimately she was, I think they were at college together, and she was completely treated like a victim, despite her own admission, basically saying that he hadn't done anything wrong. She just felt uncomfy about it. And it really is like when you open the aperture to such a degree that it is impossible to prove somebody wrong when they say that they've been assaulted. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I agree that that's messed up. I think that's a prime example of something that has gone way too far.
Okay, we only got a few left here. Mecha Wing Zero says, Allie, what are your thoughts on a couple getting married in God's eyes with a spiritual commitment without involving the state? And I would say here, this is, especially among men's communities, this is getting more popular, the idea of a private contract marriage, where essentially you don't get legally married, rather you draw up either your own private contract or simply act as a married couple without involving the state in order to try at least to not involve some of the legal risks. At least I think that's what he's saying.
I mean, I think it's interesting that the discussion kind of goes one of two ways. Either it's we want the state way more involved and we want them to be involved with enforcing things like prenups, and we want them to like really be kind of meddling with, I know meddling is a bad word, but like really enforcing a high barrier to entry, or we want there to be no barrier to entry at all. And I see a lot of the same people kind of pushing both ideas in tandem, which I find really odd. It's like, okay, do you want it to be harder to leave a marriage or not? And one of the things that, like, I think if a couple truly just wants to get married in the eyes of God and not of the state, I mean, go for it, but you're not actually more protected. I mean, custody issues, for example, still come up regardless of how you father a child. Men have fewer rights if they're not already married to the woman in the eyes of the state. So if you want, we often hear custody issues cited. If you want help getting custody of your children, you're going to have a much easier time doing that if you are legally married to her, because then you are by default considered to be the father. So I don't know. I just don't, I guess, view this as like the solution to everything. And I think that if you're that much of an anti-statist, like ANCAP libertarian type, fine. My boyfriend is total, like, I would say ANCAP type, and thinks that's idiotic. Mostly because it doesn't actually help men in the long term. You have kind of less backing than you would otherwise. And she can still come after you as far as like community property in a lot of states. So it doesn't really protect your property either.
Okay. Well, I will say I am an ANCAP in principle. However, I would agree that the state is a reality right now, whether I like it or not. And therefore I have to deal with those realities. Now, this next one should elicit some discussion. Contra Chaos.
Yes, completely.
Just to let you know, and he and I comment back and forth on Twitter quite frequently. He is a Christian nationalist. He asked, do you support repealing the 19th Amendment?
I have kind of, I guess, a more nuanced belief of it. I think that kind of individual voting rather than like family-based voting is probably a net negative. I would support family-based voting and like a man and wife. Maybe if you're a man and wife with children, you get 2.5 votes and your whole family votes as a block. I'd be fine with that. I think that would actually solve a lot of the issues. And I think men and women tend to vote the same anyway. I would be perfectly happy to have my husband voting for our family. I don't think it makes sense to have like lots of young single people, regardless of whether they're men or women, voting. You don't really have an investment in the future if you don't have children. And I do think that we should be privileging, and certainly as citizens privileging families if we're going to go that route. I don't think that just taking voting rights away from women is, with no other improvements, that helpful. I think we should just encourage people to get married and you get extra votes or whatever. Maybe own property. Right. I think I'm sympathetic to those arguments too.
Okay, and I will answer this as well. I will say again first, everybody who's followed my podcast for a while knows I'm a libertarian. I don't believe in democracy, period. I think democracy sucks. And even being a libertarian, I would actually agree with Hans Hermann Hoppe's argument that if you compare the various forms of government, monarchy is in fact a superior form of government to democracy. Although I won't get into why that is for right now. I will just say, setting that question aside, if we're going to have democracy, what is the best way to distribute the right to vote? My position on this is you should not be voting unless two conditions are met. One, you must be a net taxpayer. And by that, I don't just mean do you technically pay taxes. I mean that when you take the money that's subtracted from your pay compared to the amount of services you receive from the government, do you actually pay out? So that being that's being the first condition. If
we're doing Rothbard in here.
Yes. So if you are going to vote, you need to, one, be a net taxpayer. And then two, if you're going to vote, I'm almost inclined to say you need to have served in the military, although I will at least cut it off at you must be subject to the military draft. And it has been my experience, the vast, vast majority of women, even so-called feminists who totally believe in equality, claim they don't believe women should be subject to the draft. But my point is, you should not be able to vote. We have a problem in society. If you're able to vote to raise other people's taxes when you know you'll never be paying them yourself, that's a problem. It's also a problem if you can vote to send other people to war, knowing that you'll never have to fight it yourself. That's also a problem. So I'm just saying those 2 points. You must, one, if you're going to be able to vote on tax policy, you need to be a taxpayer. If you're going to be able to vote on war policy, you need to be subject to fighting in that war. That's my opinion.
I would totally agree with that. I think with probably some nuance around the war aspect, just because men over a certain age aren't going to war, or disabled men, or certainly obese men can't really get sent to war most of the time. So maybe it would keep the obesity rate down. But no, I tweeted something actually about women in draft yesterday and got a whole bunch of pushback. I don't really support a draft in general, but if they're going to have one, I don't see why women wouldn't be involved in it, at least in some capacity. But I don't know. I would tend to agree with you on most points.
Okay.
I just want to add something really quickly. It's kind of interesting that you're talking about the draft and women in the draft potentially, when I just posted something yesterday, and it was that clip from Parks and Recreations. And I label it, I still call this when World War III starts and when women find out they're getting the draft. If you want to go find that on Twitter, that's fine. But that's kind of interesting. I just wanted to bring that up.
All right.
I'm not familiar with the clip, but that'd be great.
Okay, awesome. Well, Night Shift, thank you for doing the chat moderation. We've already gone almost 45 minutes longer than the show usually does, but I'm glad because I think this was a great discussion. Obviously, there are still some points we disagree on, but I hope that, after talking and everybody listening, we at least have a better understanding of where each other are coming from, which, of course, on Twitter, it seems that's never the case. So
very true.
Yeah, I'm very grateful that you agreed to come on, especially considering I think I have just under 1,000 Twitter followers. You have something like 6,000. So very flattered that you chose to come on my show. But I will, to end, I would just ask, what is your message to men in the greater red pill space? If you have a minute to give your best pitch, whether that's get married, don't get married, what do you think? Men that consider themselves part of the red pill, what do you want them to hear?
I would say at least if you would like to get married and do some soul searching, do the best that you can to make that happen. I don't think that anyone's lives are improved by ultimate risk avoidance at the cost of potential happiness. And I do think that there are often greater risks to not getting married than to at least going for it. If you're not into it, you're not into it. But I do think that happy marriages are possible, and focusing on what we can do versus on hoping that the world changes is a much better recipe for happiness and self-fulfillment.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. And as I've said many times, at the end of the day, I'm here to give you my 2 cents. My viewpoint is to all the men out there is I would agree with you, take responsibility for what you can. At the end of the day, so long as you're making the decision that you've objectively decided is best for you, because you've weighed the costs and benefits and decided that's what's best for you, then I applaud you. I would discourage anyone from making a decision about marriage because they were shamed into it because someone told them you have a moral obligation to get married. You're dishonoring your ancestors because you don't get married, or whatever the other arguments may be. Ultimately, if you're going to get married, I hope it's because you've objectively weighed the costs and benefits and decide that's what's best for you. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Allie, for being on again. And everyone, as always, that is my 2 cents. You may take it for what it's worth.
Thanks for having me.